half dead. That was the word the auctioneer used, and he used it without cruelty, the way a man names weather. The foal lay in the dirt of the ring in the little livestock yard outside of Willow Finn, its legs folded wrong under it, its ribs pushing at a coat that had gone dull as ash, and its eye, the one eye it kept open, followed nothing at all. Nobody bid. Why would they? A colt that couldn't stand on its own the day it went through the ring was a colt that wouldn't stand at all, and every man leaning on that rail in Coldwater County knew it, had known it their whole lives, had watched 100 such creatures carted off behind the barn and not thought twice. So when the girl raised 2 fingers from the back row and said, plainly, that she'd give $5 for him, the whole yard turned to look at her, the way you'd look at somebody laughing at a funeral. Her name was Marin Alcott, and she was 22 years old, and she had been back in Coldwater County for exactly 9 days. She did not explain herself. She walked down through the rows of folding chairs with her hands loose at her sides, past men who smelled of diesel and chewing tobacco, and she paid the $5 in wrinkled bills to a clerk who counted them twice as though the arithmetic might change. And then she knelt in the dirt beside the foal and put one hand flat on its neck and looked at it for a long time without saying anything at all. That was the thing people would remember later, when everything had turned. Not that she'd bought it, that she'd looked at it so long before she did anything else, like she was reading something written on it that the rest of them couldn't see. If you know somebody who's ever been told that the thing they love, or the thing they made, or the thing they are, isn't worth the trouble, do me a favor and tap that like button, and leave a comment telling me what town you're watching from tonight, because I read every single one of them, and I like knowing where in the world this story is landing. Say it plain, the way Marin would. Now let me take you back, because there is a great deal that has to happen between a $5 colt in the dirt and the day this girl's name meant something in 3 states. Marin had grown up on the far edge of Coldwater County, out past where the pavement gave up and the road turned to the pale washboard gravel they called Sorrel Ridge Road, on a piece of ground her family had held for 4 generations without ever getting rich off it. Her grandfather, Elias Alcott, had run horses there, not the fast, glossy kind that ran for money, but working stock, animals bred for endurance and sense, and a kind of steadiness that showed up over 40 miles and not over 40 yards. He died when Marin was 15, and after that the place went quiet the way places do, the barn settling on its haunches, the fence lines slacking, the pastures going to broom sedge and thistle. Marin's mother had married a man from the city and moved 300 miles east, and Marin had gone with them, and she had spent the years between 15 and 22 learning that a city could hold a person without ever once wanting her. She came back not because she had a plan. She wanted that understood later when people started calling her shrewd. She came back because her great-aunt Verna was 81 and living alone in the old house and had fallen twice that winter, and because Marin's mother couldn't leave her job, and because somebody had to, and Marin was the only one whose life was loose enough at the edges to be pulled. So she loaded what she owned into a hatchback that burned oil, and she drove west into weather, and she arrived on Sorrel Ridge Road on a gray afternoon in March to find the house smaller than she remembered, and Verna in the kitchen shelling nothing, just sitting with her hands folded on the oilcloth as if waiting for a train that had stopped running years ago. Verna Alcott was a woman who had earned the right to say very little and did. She wore her dead husband's canvas coat around the house because it was warm and because it was there, and she wore it without one flicker of self-consciousness. The sleeves rolled to her forearms, the collar gone soft with years. She looked Marin up and down when the girl came through the door and said only, "You got taller and thinner. That's the wrong direction for both." Then she put the kettle on. That was the welcome. It was, Marin would come to understand, a considerable one. They fell into a rhythm, the two of them, in that first stretch. Marin fixed what she could, the porch step that had rotted through, the pump that had lost its prime, the gutter hanging off the eave like a broken arm. Verna sat and watched and offered corrections in the fewest possible words. And in the evenings, when the light went long and gold across the broom sedge, Marin would walk the old pastures just to be out of the house, and she would stand at the fence and look at the empty ground where her grandfather's horses used to graze, and she felt something she couldn't name. Not quite grief, more like a question the land was asking her that she didn't yet have the words to answer. It was Verna who set her toward the livestock yard, though Verna would never have called it that. There was a woman in Willow Finn who owed the Alcotts money from a hay deal going back to Elias's time, and Verna wanted it collected, and she sent Marin to town on the Saturday the yard held its spring sale because the woman would be there and couldn't dodge. So Marin went for a debt and came home with a colt, which was exactly the kind of arithmetic that made the men at the yard laugh into their coffee. She never did collect the debt. She stood at the back of the crowd watching the animals go through, the sound stock bringing sound prices, the culls bringing pennies, and then they brought out the foal that couldn't stand, and something in Marin went still and certain the way it hadn't been still and certain about anything in 7 years. She didn't know why. She would tell people later that she didn't know why, and it was true, and it was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was in the shape of the animal's head, the width between the eyes, the length of cannon bone even on a body wrecked by whatever had wrecked it, proportions her grandfather had pointed at 1,000 times across 1,000 suppers, saying them like a catechism, get the frame right and the rest you can build. She hadn't known she'd kept it, but it had been in her the whole time, the way a language you learned young stays folded up somewhere behind your teeth. And when she saw that ruined colt in the dirt, she was 15 again, standing at Elias's elbow, and her grandfather's voice came up out of the ground and said, get the frame right, and she raised 2 fingers and said $5. Getting him home was its own comedy. A man named Del Prewitt, who ran the yard and had known Elias and did not entirely dislike the Alcotts, lent her a stock trailer and a strong opinion. You're throwing good gas after a dead horse, he said, which he thought was funny, and which several men repeated for the rest of that spring. Del was not cruel. He was the kind of man who had watched the county's economy his whole life, and had learned its rules the hard way, and now mistook those rules for the whole of reality, which is the most common way in the world to be wrong. He helped Marin winch the foal up the ramp with a canvas sling because he wasn't going to let an animal suffer being dragged, and the whole time he did it he told her kindly all the reasons it wouldn't work. She let him. She had already learned that the fastest way to end a lecture was to agree with none of it and argue with none of it either. The foal. She would not name it for a long while, superstitious about naming a thing you might have to bury, did not die that first night, though she sat up with it in the barn expecting it to. It was down with something the county vet, when he finally came out, called a tangle of troubles. A joint infection in one hock, malnutrition, a gut full of the wrong things, and a weakness in the hindquarters that might have been injury and might have been the way it was born. The vet, a decent tired man named Ott Seeley, gave the colt about the same odds Del had. He wrote out what to do anyway, because Marin asked him to, and because she asked in a way that made refusing feel like the childish choice. Twice a day on the joint, he said. You'll want to flush it. It's ugly work, and it might come to nothing. Might come to nothing. There it was again, the thesis of the whole county laid down plain, and Marin nodded and paid him and did not believe him for 1 second, though she couldn't have told you where the disbelief came from. She flushed the joint twice a day. She mixed the feed by hand, small and often, the way you'd feed a bird, and she sat with the colt in the straw with a book she wasn't reading and let it get used to her being there. She kept a notebook, a habit that would matter enormously later, and in it she wrote down everything. What the colt ate and when, the color of the drainage from the hock, the number of minutes it could hold itself up before its hind end folded. She wrote in the plainest hand, no adjectives, just the facts arranged in columns, the way she had seen her grandfather's records kept in the ledgers still stacked in the tack room, which she had not yet thought to open. Verna watched all this from the kitchen window and said nothing about it for 3 weeks. And then one evening, as Marin came in smelling of iodine and straw, the old woman looked up from her tea and said the first thing she'd said about the whole enterprise. "Your grandfather," she said, "would have bought that colt too." And then, before Marin could answer, "And everybody would have laughed at him the same." She said it without warmth and without doubt, and it landed in Marin harder than any encouragement could have, because it was not encouragement. It was recognition. The colt stood on its own for the first time on a morning in late April, and it stayed standing for 11 minutes, and Marin wrote the number down before she let herself feel anything about it. By May, he could walk the length of the barn. By the first week of June, he could follow her out into the small paddock she'd patched together from the soundest of the old fence, and he'd stand in the sun with his ruined coat starting, just barely, to come in dark and slick underneath the ash-gray dead hair. And it was then that she named him. She named him Ledger for the columns in her notebook and for the books in the tack room she had finally, that same week, sat down and begun to read. Because when she opened those books, everything changed, though it would take 6 years for the county to notice. Elias Alcott's ledgers went back 60 years, and they were not the records of a man who bred horses by luck. They were the records of a man who had been building, patiently, across decades, a specific and deliberate line, tracking sires and dams and the traits that came down through them, noting which crosses produced the sound feet and the deep wind and the level heads, culling ruthlessly on paper long before he culled on the ground. And threaded through the columns, in the margins, in his cramped upright hand, were his sayings, the ones Marin half remembered from childhood, written down as if he'd known someone would need them after he was gone. One of them she read on the first night and could not stop reading, going back to it the way your tongue goes back to a sore tooth. "Slow blood runs deepest," he had written, next to a note about a mare he'd nearly sold and hadn't. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she copied it into her own notebook on the first page, above her columns, and it became the thing she said to herself in the hard stretches that were coming, the phrase she'd repeat like a man saying grace. "Slow blood runs deepest." She said it to the colt. She said it to the empty pastures. She would, in time, say it to a room full of people who had paid a great deal to hear her say anything at all, though she didn't know that yet, and wouldn't have believed it if the ledgers themselves had told her. What the ledgers told her instead was this: the colt she had bought for $5 carried a name in his papers. The yard had almost thrown the papers out, and had handed them to her folded and coffee-stained as an afterthought, and the name was Alcott. Or half of it was. His dam traced back, 4 generations removed, to a mare Elias had bred and sold in a lean year, one of the few good ones he'd ever let leave the place. And Marin found the mare in the ledger with a note beside her sale that said, simply, "Hardest thing I ever did, sold her to eat." The blood her grandfather had spent his life building had gone out into the county and scattered and thinned and been forgotten, crossed with anything and nothing, until it surfaced again, by pure accident, in a half-dead colt in a livestock ring that no one wanted. Marin sat in the tack room with the ledger open on her knees and the lantern hissing, and she understood, all at once, that she had not bought a charity case. She had bought back a piece of something her grandfather had grieved letting go. The frame she'd recognized in the dirt was his frame. The proportions were the ones he'd chased for 60 years. Get the frame right, and the rest you can build. She had. She just hadn't known it was already right. She told Verna the next morning, laying the ledger on the oilcloth and pointing at the mare's line, and then out the window at the colt in the paddock. Verna looked at it for a long time, longer even than Marin had looked at the colt in the ring, and when she spoke she didn't say anything about the blood or the line or the accident of it. She said, He wrote all that down and nobody ever read it. And there was something in her voice, some old accumulated ache, that told Marin the not reading had been a grief in that house for a long time, that Elias had died believing the thing he'd built would die with him, because there was no one left who could see it. "Well," Marin said, "I read it." Verna nodded once and got up to put the kettle on, which was how she cried, and Marin pretended not to notice, which was how she let her. The work after that was slow and unglamorous, and mostly invisible to anyone driving past on Sorrel Ridge Road, which meant the county went right on believing the girl had wasted $5 and a whole spring on a cripple. Marin didn't correct them. She had learned that a thing defended with words gets weaker, and a thing defended with results gets stronger. And she had a colt to bring up and no money to do it with, so she got a job. She drove 3 mornings a week to Willow Finn and worked the counter at the feed store, which was the beating heart of every wrong opinion in Coldwater County, the place where the men gathered to drink burnt coffee and pronounce judgment, and it was there she heard herself discussed as though she weren't standing 4 feet away weighing out somebody's chick starter. "Alcott girls still got that dead colt," one would say, and another would say Elias would roll over, which was so precisely exactly backward that Marin had to turn to the register to keep her face still. She never argued. She rang up the sales. She listened, and in the listening she learned the county, who had good mares going to waste, who'd overpaid for fashionable blood that couldn't cross a creek, who was land poor and stock poor and too proud to say so. And all of it went eventually into the notebook. The feed store was run by a widow named Ophi Dunmore, who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted everyone's expectations, including her own. And Ophi took a liking to Marin for reasons she never bothered to explain, the way certain older women simply decide a young one is worth their trouble. She let Marin buy on credit against her wages when the colt needed more than the wages covered, and she did it quietly, marking it in her own book, and she was the first person in town outside that house on Sorrel Ridge Road to say a kind word about the enterprise, though she said it in her fashion. "Half these men," Ophi told her one slow afternoon, wiping the counter that didn't need it, "wouldn't know a good horse if it bit them, on account of they only ever look at the price tag." Then she went back to wiping. It wasn't much, but it was the first crack in the wall, and Marin remembered it. By the end of that first summer, Ledger was a yearling, in fact, and looked like a horse in a way that startled people who'd seen him in the ring. The frame had filled. The dead coat had shed out entirely and come in a deep liver chestnut so dark it looked black in shade, with one white sock on the off hind. And he moved. This was the thing Marin couldn't stop watching. He moved with a low-reaching stride that ate ground without seeming to hurry, the exact gait Elias had circled and starred in the ledgers as the whole point, the thing worth 60 years. Aunt Seeley came out to look at another animal that fall and stood at the paddock fence a long while and said finally, "That's not the same colt." Marin said it was. He shook his head. "It is, and it isn't," he said, which was as close as a scientific man could come to admitting he'd been wrong about the odds. And then he asked her, half joking, whether she meant to breed it, and Marin said she meant to breed 100 like it, and Ott laughed because he thought she was joking too. She wasn't. She had already worked the whole thing out in the notebook on the long nights, using her grandfather's math. She was going to rebuild the line, not fast, not with money she didn't have. She was going to do it the slow way, the only way it had ever been done, the way that ran deepest. She started that autumn by leasing, not buying, the 2 best mares she could find going to waste in the county. One from a man too old to ride and too broke to feed her right. One from a widow who wanted the animal gone but couldn't bear to sell her to slaughter. Marin offered board and care, and a share of any foal in exchange for the use of them, terms that cost her almost nothing but her own labor, which she had in abundance and no other use for. The old man agreed because it was better than watching his mare starve. The widow agreed because Marin looked at the mare before she said anything about terms, the same long, silent way she'd looked at the colt in the ring. And the widow later told Ophi that she'd have handed the animal over for free just for the way the girl had looked at her, like she was worth looking at. Word of that, small as it was, moved. In a county with nothing to talk about, everything gets talked about. And the story of the Alcott girl who looked at horses before she bought them began very slowly to circulate, not as praise yet, as oddity. But oddity is the seed of reputation, and Marin, without meaning to, had planted it. The first hard winter tested her. Ledger colicked in January, badly in the small hours, and Marin walked him in the frozen paddock for 6 hours by lantern light, one hand on his halter, saying the phrase over and over into the steam of her own breath. Slow blood runs deepest until the horse passed what he needed to pass and stood trembling and alive in the blue dawn. She didn't call the vet because she couldn't afford to, and because she knew from the ledgers what to do. And she did it, and it worked, and she wrote it down. She was becoming, without any diploma to say so, the thing her grandfather had been, a person who knew this particular blood in her hands and in her bones. Verna, who did not sleep much anymore, had watched the whole night from the kitchen window. And in the morning she had a pot of oatmeal ready, and she said over it, "You'd have made him proud, and it would have annoyed him both," which was the highest and most complicated praise the old woman had in her, and Marin took it and held it. Spring came, and the least mares foaled, and one of the two foals, bred, on paper, back toward the old line by a stallion Marin had chosen after 3 weeks of studying Elias's cross charts, dropped into the straw and shook its head and stood within the hour on legs so correct that Marin, who did not cry easily, had to leave the barn and stand in the dark and breathe. It had the frame. It had the reach. It was, to any eye that knew what to look for, unmistakable. And that was the problem and the opportunity both, because almost no eye in Coldwater County knew what to look for anymore. The knowledge had gone out of the county the way it had gone out of the Alcott house, scattered and forgotten. And Marin realized standing in that dark that she wasn't only rebuilding a line of horses. She was rebuilding the eyes that could see them. She would have to. Nobody would pay for what nobody could recognize. So she did a thing that Del Prewitt and the feed store men would have called foolish, if they'd understood it, which they didn't. She started giving the young horses away to use, not selling, lending. She found the men in 3 counties who still did real work off horseback, the ones who ran cattle in country too broken for machines, the ones who packed into the back country, the endurance riders who logged their 40 and 50-mile days on the calendar and cared about nothing but whether an animal could stand it. And she offered them a 2-year-old to try, free, on the single condition that they tell her honestly how it held up. It was a way of putting her grandfather's blood back under the exact kind of work it had been bred for, in front of the exact kind of people who would know it when they felt it, and it cost her the sale of every animal she placed. Ophi thought she'd lost her mind. Verna said nothing, which meant she approved. And the men who took those horses, Marin chose them as carefully as she chose the crosses, rode them hard through a season and came back changed. Because the horses did not break down, did not sour, did not quit at mile 30 when everything else quit, and a rider who has felt that under him will talk about it for the rest of his life. That was the marketing. That was the only marketing there ever was. She never bought an advertisement. She never had to. The first man to come back and demand to buy the horse he'd been lent was a cattleman named Rufus Kettleman from over in the next county, a hard-handed, skeptical man who had taken the 2-year-old mostly to prove Marin wrong and prove himself the shrewd judge he believed himself to be. He came up Sorrel Ridge Road in a dust cloud in the second autumn and got out of his truck and didn't waste time. "I'm not giving her back," he said. Name your price." Marin looked at him for a while. "She's not for sale," she said, "but her foals will be, and you're first on the list if you breed her to what I tell you to." Kettleman didn't like being managed and said so, and Marin said flatly, "Then give her back." And he stood there in the yard doing the arithmetic on his face, and everybody watching could see the exact moment he understood that the girl held all the cards, and that she'd built the hand so quietly he'd never seen it dealt. He bred the mare to what she told him to, of course he did, and the foal that came of it 2 years on would sell for more than Rufus Kettleman had ever paid for any animal in his life, and he would consider it the best money he ever spent, and he would say so to anyone who'd stand still, and every word of it was more advertising Marin never paid for. Somewhere in the 3rd year, the tone at the feed store changed, though no one announced it, and Del Prewitt least of all. It went from "Alcott girls still got that colt" to a kind of wary curiosity, men asking Ophi, lo, what exactly the girl was doing out there, and how she got hold of blood like that, and whether it was true what Kettleman said. Ophi, who had watched the whole thing from behind her counter with enormous private satisfaction, told them the truth, which was that Marin had bought a dying foal nobody wanted for $5 and read a dead man's books and worked 18-hour days for 3 years, and the men didn't quite know what to do with that answer because there was no trick in it, no luck, no windfall, nothing they could dismiss. It was just the thing they'd all said was worthless, turning out to be worth everything in front of them, on time, exactly as slow as it had to be. That is the hardest thing in the world for a certain kind of man to watch, and Coldwater County had a whole coffee counter full of that kind of man, and Marin rang up their feed with a level face while they came, one by one, to the edge of admitting it. Del Prewitt held out longest, which was fitting, because he'd said the harshest thing at the start. It was Del who'd said, that first spring, loud enough for the whole yard, that blood's been dead for 20 years, and dead blood leads to nothing. And it was a good line, a memorable line, the exact wrong prophecy the whole story existed to overturn, and Marin had filed it away without a word. Dead blood leads to nothing. She thought about it sometimes on the good nights, standing at the fence watching a new foal find its legs, and she never once felt the urge to drive to town and throw it back in Del's face, because she understood something Del didn't, that the blood had never been dead. It had only been unread. There is a great difference between a thing that is worthless and a thing that no one has taken the trouble to understand, and the whole tragedy of Coldwater County, the whole tragedy of a great many places, is that it cannot tell the two apart. Marin could. She'd been the kind of person the county couldn't tell from worthless once. Maybe that was why she'd seen the colt. The turn, when it finally came for Del, came quietly, which was the only way Marin would have respected it. It was the 4th spring, and Del's own operation had hit a wall. He ran good commercial stock, but he'd been buying the fashionable blood the ledgers had warned against, animals bred for the show ring and the sale photo, and they were falling apart under real work the way Elias had predicted on paper decades before either of them was born. Del drove out to Sorrel Ridge Road on a Sunday, alone, no audience, and he stood at the paddock fence a long time watching Marin's 3-year-olds move. And when Marin came out, he didn't make a large production of it. He said, "I said some things." Marin waited. About the blood. She still waited, because she'd learned that from Verna, that silence does more work than any answer. Del looked at the horses and nodded her. "I was going by the price it brought," he said, "and I forgot the price a thing brings, and the worth of it aren't always the same number." It was, coming from Del Prewitt, a nearly unbearable confession, and Marin had the grace not to make him say more. "You want to breed your good mare to my stud," she said. Not a question, and Del said yes, that was about the size of it, and she said all right, and they walked to the barn to look at the book, and that was the end of the war, such as it had been. He never apologized in words, and she never asked him to. He just started sending her mares and sending her business and telling the men at his own yard when a good young horse came through to check its papers for the Alcott name. And there was no undoing a reputation once Del Prewitt began building it, because he was the man everyone had trusted to tear it down. By the 5th year, the horses were selling before they were born. Marrin kept a list in the notebook of who had put money down against a foal not yet conceived, and the list ran to 2 pages and then to 3, and it included men from 4 states and a woman from farther than that who bred endurance horses for a living and had heard, the way everyone heard, by word of mouth, from someone who'd felt one of Marrin's animals under them and could not shut up about it. Marrin raised her prices slowly, always a step behind what the demand would have borne, because Elias had written in the margins, "Never take the top dollar, leave them glad, and a man who leaves your place glad comes back and brings his neighbor." And it was true. It was demonstrably true. She watched it be true, year over year. She did not borrow money. She did not build a fancy barn. She fixed the old one board by board out of what the horses brought, and she added fence only as far as she had horses to fill it, and she let the demand pull the whole thing forward at exactly the pace it could bear, the way you'd let a young horse find its own stride instead of forcing it. Slow blood runs deepest. She'd known what it meant for years by then. It had never only been about the horses. She hired the Bledsoe boy, Tam, a 16-year-old from down the ridge whose father drank and whose future had looked, to everyone, including Tam, like nothing much. Marrin looked at him the long way, the way she looked at everything, and saw what the county hadn't bothered to see, and she taught him the ledgers and the crosses and the flushing of a bad joint and the walking of a cold-licked horse in the frozen dark, and Tam took to it the way a plant takes to water it's been denied. He became, over 2 years, the second person alive who could see the blood the way Elias had, and that mattered more to Marrin than any sale, because she had learned from her grandfather's grief what happens to knowledge that only one person holds. She was not going to let it die twice. She wrote it all down for Tam and made him write it too, and the notebooks multiplied on the tackroom shelf beside the old ledgers, the dead man's hand and the living hands together, and anyone who understood what they were looking at would have understood they were looking at the most valuable thing in Coldwater County, sitting on a shelf in a barn that still leaned a little to the west. Verna lived to see the 6th spring, though only just. She had gone very small and very quiet by then, spending her days in Elias's chair by the window where she could see the paddocks, and she watched the foals come with an expression Marrin couldn't always read, but had stopped needing to. One afternoon in that last April, Marrin brought a new colt up to the window so Verna could see it through the glass, a colt already sold, 3 states away, for a sum that would have made the whole county sit down. And Verna looked at it a long time, and then she looked at Marrin, and she said, "You put him back." Marrin didn't understand at first. "Your grandfather," Verna said. "He thought he'd lost it. He died thinking he'd lost it." Her voice was very thin. "You put it back." And Marrin understood that Verna wasn't only talking about the blood, that she was talking about all of it. The house and the ledgers and the name and the man himself, everything that had gone quiet and been given up for lost. And that in some way, past explaining, Marrin had reached back across 6 years and lifted a weight off a dead man's chest and off the living woman who'd carried his grief since. Marrin sat down beside the chair and took the old hand in both of hers, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing else, and the colt grazed outside the window in the long gold light, and it was enough. Verna Alcott died in her sleep in the first week of May, in the house on Sorrel Ridge Road, with the window open so she could hear the horses. The whole county came to the burying, which surprised Marrin until she thought about it, and then it didn't surprise her at all. Verna had outlasted everyone. and the county respected nothing so much as endurance, which was, Marin thought, standing at the graveside, the whole thing in a single word, the thing Elias had bred for, and the thing Verna had lived, the thing that ran deepest. Del Prewitt came and stood at the back with his hat in his hands. Ophi Dunmore closed the feed store for the day, which she had not done for either of her own husbands. Rufus Kettleman drove 2 counties over and didn't say much, and left an envelope of cash on the porch that Marin never opened and never mentioned, because she understood it wasn't money. It was a man who didn't have words, using the only language he trusted. Tam Bledsoe stood beside Marin the whole time, like the son the place had never had, and maybe now did. After the burying, Marin went back to the ledgers, because that was where Verna was, more than in the ground. Verna was in the margins where Elias's hand recorded the mare he'd sold to eat, the hardest thing he ever did. And Verna was in the 60 years of patient columns, and she was in the phrase on the first page of Marin's own notebook, the phrase Marin had read that first night and copied down and lived by. Slow blood runs deepest. Marin sat in the tack room the evening of the funeral with both books open, the dead man's and her own, and outside the horses moved in the dusk, dark shapes in dark grass, the blood he'd built and grieved and been mocked for and died believing lost, running now stronger than it had ever run, out into 3 states and coming back, always coming back, because she'd built it so they'd want to come back. And she understood, finally and completely, that the $5 in the livestock ring had never been charity, and had never been luck. It had been recognition. She had seen her grandfather's whole life lying in the dirt where the county had thrown it, and she had knelt down and looked at it a long time, the way you look at something you love, and then she had picked it up. The county calls her something different now. They call her, when they need her, the one who knows. As in, take it to the Alcott place. She'll know. She can look at a horse and tell you things you can't. Men who once laughed into their coffee now drive 2 hours to have her stand at their fence and look, just look, the long, silent way, and pronounce on an animal's worth, and they pay her for the looking and consider it cheap. She's expanded, but she's done it the same way she's done everything, 1 sound board and 1 sound mare at a time, no debt, no ceremony, letting the wanton pull it forward, and the barn stands straight now, and the fence runs true to the far tree line, and Tam Bledsoe has a title and a wage, and a future he could never have imagined down the ridge. The horse called Ledger, the $5 colt, is old now, and gray around the eyes and grazes the near paddock like a founding father, and his sons and daughters and their sons and daughters carry the frame Elias chased for 60 years into work all over the West, and every so often one of them comes up for sale, and the price it brings would silence the whole coffee counter, though the coffee counter went silent on the subject years ago. And sometimes on a gray afternoon a young horse will come through the little livestock yard in Willow Finn, looking rough, dull-coated, folded wrong, the kind nobody bids on, and Del Prewitt, who runs the yard still, older now, slower, will hold the gavel a beat longer than he used to, and glance toward the back of the crowd, half expecting to see a girl there with her hands loose at her sides, reading something on the animal the rest of them can't see. She's usually not there. She doesn't need to be anymore. But everyone who was there that first spring knows the story, and they tell it to the ones who weren't, and it always ends the same way, with the same quiet astonishment, because it never stops being astonishing that the thing they all agreed was worthless was, the whole time, worth more than everything they owned put together. It only needed someone to take the trouble to see it. If this story reached you tonight, do something with it before you click away. Send it to someone you know who's been told that the thing they've got, or the thing they love, or the thing they are, isn't worth much, because those are exactly the people who need to hear how slow blood runs, and how long the county can be wrong before reality quietly proves it so. Then tell me in the comments about a time you saw worth in something everyone else had written off, whether it was an animal or a piece of land or a person or your own stubborn self, because I want to hear it, and I mean that. And let me know what town you're watching from, way out wherever you are, on whatever gray or golden afternoon this found you, because I read every comment that comes in, every single one. The way Marin read those ledgers, slowly, and all the way to the end, looking for the thing that everybody else walked past. The comments came in from everywhere after that, though Marin would never see most of them and wouldn't have known what to make of the one she did. But the story kept moving the way the horses did, out and out, and coming back changed. A woman in the high desert who bred for a living wrote to say she'd driven 11 hours to Sorrel Ridge Road on the strength of a rumor, and stood at the fence and understood inside of 5 minutes what all the fuss had been about. A man in cattle country wrote that he'd bought an Alcott mare on his last dollar, and she'd carried him through 3 of the hardest gathers of his life without a misstep, and that he'd named his daughter's first pony after Elias, a man he'd never met and never could. The name traveled farther than the horses did, and the phrase traveled with it, because Marin had taken to writing it, plain and unexplained, on the bill of sale that went out with every animal. Slow blood runs deepest. Buyers framed those papers. Some of them, she heard later, framed them and hung them where their children could see, which was exactly what Elias had done with his sayings in the margins, writing for someone he'd never meet. Tam Bledsoe married a girl from Willow Finn in the 7th year, and they built a small house at the low end of the property, on ground Marin gave him outright, no papers, no ceremony, just the deed slid across the oilcloth one morning the way Verna had once slid a cup of tea. You put it back too, she told him, and he didn't understand, and she said he would, in time, and he did. Because that was the thing she'd come to see most clearly of all, in the long evenings with both books open and the horses dark in the grass. That the blood and the knowledge and the looking were all the same thing, all one inheritance, and that an inheritance is not a thing you keep. It is a thing you pass, or it dies in your hands. Elias had nearly let it die by holding it too close, by writing it down but telling no one, by grieving alone in a chair by a window. Marin was not going to make that mistake. She had already made herself the least necessary person on the place, which was the whole point, because a thing that needs one person to survive is a thing that is already dying, and a thing that a dozen hands can carry runs deepest of all. Ledger died in the 8th year, old and easy, on a soft morning in grass he'd grazed for most of his life, and Marin buried him herself in the near paddock where Verna could see him from the ground, or where Marin liked to think she could. She stood over the place a long time, the long silent way, the way she'd stood over him in the dirt of the ring when he was $5 and a bad bet and the whole county's certainty that he'd come to nothing. Dead blood leads to nothing, Dell had said, all those years ago, and Dell himself came out that afternoon, old now, to stand beside her at the grave, and neither of them said the line, and neither of them had to. The horse had turned it inside out just by living, just by getting up when he wasn't supposed to, and running when he wasn't supposed to, and throwing sons and daughters who did the same, on, into a future the doubters couldn't have imagined and wouldn't live to see the end of, because it had no end. That was the thing about blood done right. It didn't stop. Marin went back to the tack room that evening, as she always did, and she opened the newest notebook, and under the day's plain columns she wrote 3 words she had never written before in all those years. Not once, though she'd said them 10,000 times. She wrote, in her level, unadorned hand, the phrase itself, and then beneath it, the way Elias would have, she added a note in the margin for whoever came after, for Tam or Tam's children or some stranger not yet born who would sit in this room and read by this light and need to understand. He was right, she wrote. Grandfather was right the whole time. And the horses moved in the dusk outside the window, dark shapes in dark grass, the proof of it, running.